everything that you just said about China's 5-year plan, its long-term vision, how it approaches the world situation, a lot of people in the United States have a hard time with this because, and China has been talking a lot about, especially in its recent course of development, its connections to its own civilization, its long history, 5,000 plus years. What do you think that kind of history contributes to each respective country and their relationship, given that maybe you could help the audience understand why this.
大家好，欢迎来到本期视频。先来介绍一下背景啊。本期视频主持人是丹尼海防，他是一名美国独立记者和地缘分析师，在油管有65万粉丝。在过去超过10年时间里，他一直致力于揭露美国主导的战争及其地缘政治真相。他也是国际运动反对新冷战的创始成员之一。很多人说他的政治视角在美国算很非主流的，但他的目标也非常简单，穿透官方叙事，呈现被掩盖的事实真相。他的频道也经常会邀请来自世界各地的顶尖学者、分析师或者前政府官员，专注于解读那些真正塑造世界的地缘政治变迁，从美国霸权的衰落到多极化世界的崛起，一起探讨那些真正塑造世界的议题。他的频道质量确实挺高的，而且他本人对中国崛起也持非常积极和赞赏的态度，认为中国走出了一条卓有成效的发展道路。今天的嘉宾是高志凯，他是中国著名的学者、地缘政治评论员，曾担任邓小平的英文翻译，长期活跃于国际事务一线。他以对中美关系和全球战略极其犀利的洞察而著称。好，话不多说，我们来看本期视频吧。
I wanted to maybe ask you if you could elaborate on that last point you made, a 5,000 to 6,000 year civilization of Iran. And China has been talking a lot about, especially in its recent course of development, its connections to its own civilization, its long history, 5,000 plus years. What do you think that kind of history contributes to each respective country and their relationship, given that the United States is a much younger country and ostensibly also a much darker history in a lot of ways. Maybe you could help the audience understand why this kind of history is important to understand what's happening right now.
Well, I think, in China, we keep talking about our 5,000 years of written history, for example, and the actual history is much longer than the 5,000 years. But I think one thing which sets China apart from many other countries is that throughout our history, we always believe war should be the last resort, meaning you need to exhaust all the other evidence before you launch a war, because war in China is considered as something like an evil thing. Because war, once you launch a war, well, life will be lost, properties will be destroyed, and eventually the fate of your country may be spoiled. Is that right? So war need to be weighed back and forth, up and down, inside and outside, very, very carefully. And if you want to launch a war, you need to have full legal and moral justification to launch the war. You need to be on the right side of history. So you need to really split everything, leave no stone unturned to do your analysis, to do your preparation, and to do your justification before you launch the war. But the United States seems to shoot from the hip and very, very eager to use war as the top priority to solve whatever problems they may run into. This is a major difference. I hope China and the United States can sit down and talk about peace and launching no war, not only against each other, but against many other countries in the world. Further, I think China looks into the future with a long-term view. Allow me to mention one thing. This year, 2026, is the first year of the 15th five-year plan. Now, back in 1955, Chairman Mao Zedong was talking about maybe by the 15th five-year plan, Chinese economy may catch up, if not surpass, the United States. And lo and behold, this is exactly what's happening. Yep. So Mao Zedong back in 1955 was already prophesizing correctly what would happen in 2026 at the beginning of the 15th 5-year plan. Now, this really is something, because I don't think the Americans will be able to think that long term or plan that long term. And in China, we do have the long-term vision, and we do see into the future in terms of 100-year, 200-year, if not 500-year. And as I mentioned, probably with a little bit of exaggeration, starting from 2025, which I believed was a watershed year, I think about 5,000 years. Because you may remember when the Americans tried to push China down with maximum amount of tariff, I said, we don't care, because China has been surviving for 5,000 years, and much of the time there was no United States, and we still survived. If the United States wants to bully China, if the United States wants to lock itself out from the largest market in the world, that's the Chinese market, we, the Chinese, are already prepared to live for another 5,000 years without the United States, and we expect to survive. Now, this is not blowing something out of proportion. I say this with full confidence that if the United States wants to be an enemy of China, it will not succeed. Eventually, they need to come back to China, talk about peace with China, inevitability of peace. Again, in this war against Iran, I hope eventually the American people and the Iranian people will sit down and look at each other and say, oh, we are not enemies, we are not devils against each other. We can be just normal human beings. We can recognize each other. We are different, of course, but we can get along. And this hopefully will happen despite of all the conspiracies being spilled around by another country or another regime or another prime minister. This is crucially important. The United States, the American people on the one hand, and Iran and the Iranian people need to use their own brain to come up with their own conclusion that the United States and Iran are not enemies with each other. And they can get along with each other despite of their differences, and both of them should resist the temptation of war as being concocted by someone else.
Yeah, and maybe you're, on that note, your final word on this. I think we talked about a lot today. We covered a whole lot of ground. Maybe your reaction to a final thought that I had about everything that you just said about China's 5-year plan, its long-term vision, how it approaches the world situation. A lot of people in the United States have a hard time with this because they are often told that essentially China is its own version of the United States. Essentially, it's aggressive and it's causing so many problems for countries around the world just in its own form. And so I'm curious if you could react to this in light of the fact that, I think we're seeing with this blockade and this war in Iran that it's really hard to equalize China and the United States in terms of how they behave in the world, their overall approach to the world, because hopefully people with eyes can see that China is not blockading Cuba, it's not blockading Iran, it's not blockading Venezuela, it's not trying to choke trade routes. So your reaction to the assumption, right? We even had an Economist article recently that said China's ethnic policy around its ethnic minorities is squashing all but one, right? Of course, Han Chinese. So these are the messages people are getting. And I'm curious if you could just react to that as we close up here.
Well, thank you for giving me a minute to talk about this. I think ever since 1978, China has been practicing what we call socialism with Chinese characteristics. And this is the recipe leading to tremendous amount of transformation of China, both economically speaking as well as politically speaking. But over the decades, over the past 1 decade or so, the Americans try their best to come up with a label and put it on China. They come up with all kinds of labels like authoritarianism, totalitarianism, or even worse labels. None of them apply to China. And then a few years ago, the Americans thought they found the right label. It's called a state capitalism. And they describe China as if China has been practicing state capitalism since 1978. to such an extent, some Americans say, if state capitalism can generate economic miracles for China, we should practice state capitalism. Now, allow me to mention several things. One is that China never practiced the state capitalism and will never practice state capitalism. Secondly, China has been practicing socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, thirdly, I do believe state capitalism will never save the United States, so don't try that. Fourthly, if I have a chance through your platform to offer free advice to President Trump, I would say, President Trump, my proposal is that the United States should practice capitalism with American characteristics. Really. Just as the Chinese are practicing socialism with Chinese characteristics and generate miracles, the Americans should practice capitalism with American characteristics, which I believe will generate miracles for the Americans, which will really MAGA, which will make America great again. Now, what is capitalism with American characteristics? It has a long list, but let me be very short. First of all, you need to defend free trade. You cannot destroy free trade. Secondly, you need to protect the market economy. Don't let the state or the government intervene too much in the private practice of economy. Thirdly, you need to respect universities. Let universities be universities. Let Harvard be Harvard. Let Columbia be Columbia, rather than try to force some of the best universities to do what they do not want to do. Now, the other thing is equally important. And if President Trump and his advisors can listen to me, they probably can really save America. That is, despite of all your military might, you need to treat all the countries in the world, big or small, as equal. You cannot just lecture them. You cannot just impose your version of the truth on them. You need to let them be whatever they want to be. You do not want to impose your version of the truth on to anyone else. Don't do unto others what you do not want others to do unto you. That will pave the way for the revitalization of the United States. That will restore all the dignity and the decency and the morality for the American as a country. And that will restore the magnetism of the United States for not only talents from other countries, but wealth willingly coming to American shore. And I think manufacturing jobs will come back to the United States, because otherwise, if the United States tries to do state capitalism, it's a dead end. If the United States wants to practice imperialism or super imperialism or hyper imperialism, it's dead before it started. So think about capitalism with American characteristics, which in my view will MAGA, will make America great again.
I think it's a great place to close. Professor Victor Gao, thank you so much for joining me today. It was a wonderful
It's a great honor.
好了，这期视频就到这里了。最后，我想问大家几个问题，也想听听你们的看法。第一，很多国家都在批评中国只会呼吁和平，从以色列和加沙到委内瑞拉和古巴，再到最近的美伊战争，这样的声音从未断过。有人认为中国有实力却不出手，是自私，只顾自己发展，不管他人死活。也有人认为中国是胆子小，不敢跟美国正面单挑，怕输，怕被拖下水。还有人认为中国是在隔岸观火，坐收渔翁之利，等到各方都打累了再出来收割利益。甚至有人认为这几种心思中国都有，既胆小又自私，还精明算计。在国内也有很多人在问，为什么中国迟迟不出手呢？明明有实力，也有正义的立场，而且中国人肚子里也憋着一口气，为什么还是只停留在呼吁和关切的层面上呢？所以你们觉得中国应该更强硬的去阻止美国吗？甚至军事介入吗？对此你们怎么看呢？第二，中国人常挂在嘴边的一句话就是中华文明上下5000年。对于这段漫长的历史，人们的看法各不相同。有人认为它是一种历史包袱，容易让人过于保守，画地为牢。也有人把它看作一种战略耐心，让中国懂得等待和隐忍。还有人认为这只不过只是在吹牛，多活了几千年而已，并没有什么卵用。那么你们觉得这5000年的文明史到底给了中国什么样的地缘政治智慧呢？第三，你们觉得美国适合什么样的政治制度呢？你们觉得高教授建议的美国特色资本主义，他是在战略忽悠还是诚心建议呢？以上观点并非本频道立场，欢迎大家在评论区理性交流和补充。 另外，制作视频不易，如果您觉得做得不错，感谢您动动手指，一键3连。如果你有更多的想法或建议，也可以在评论区告诉我，我都会看见。我们下期见。